Hello there, I'm Nick Magnelli, and welcome back. In the last video, I put forth a definition for rational argumentation. I then assumed that rational argumentation exists, and I then claimed that truth exists. Moreover, there exists an underlying truth. In this video, the second video of my theological arguments, we're going to be bringing free will into the discussion. Free will. So let's begin by putting forth a definition for free will. I'm going to define free will as the process by which an immaterial self chooses, free of any deterministic, random, or otherwise material causes. It's important to put forth a definition for free will, or at least some sort of minimal characterization like I've done, because different people might have different conceptions of what free will even means. What I mean here is that some amount of the time, you have the ability to make a choice, and that choice is not determined by physical causes. It's not determined, it's not random, literally free, and that implies that there's some component to you, something like your mind, your conscience, whatever you want to call it, that's capable of making free choices. That's where your free will would be. And so, of course, that means that there is some interaction between that concept of free will and the material world. There has to be some interface that allows you to actualize the choice that you make, and that interface might be something like your mind or your conscience. But in any case, the free will itself is not physically determined. But again, people have different conceptions of what that would even mean. I'm not saying that you are always free to do anything. I'm absolutely not saying that. All I'm saying is that some amount of the time, and you don't even necessarily choose when that time would even arise, you are able to make choices. And furthermore, you are able to make choices between options that, again, you don't necessarily choose. All of that comes from somewhere else, but there is something about you that is not purely material. It's not just made of matter. There's something immaterial about you that is capable of making choices, free of deterministic influence. Now that we have that definition in play, we can get to the next claim of my argument. Claim number 2. There exists free will. Moreover, you have free will. That's my claim. And now what I'll note here is that in this case, and also in the remainder of my arguments, when I put forth a claim, is necessarily going to depend on the claims and assumptions that I've already established. So in this case, what I've already established is the existence of rational argumentation and the existence of an underlying truth. What that means is that when I say that free will exists, what I really mean here is that rational argumentation requires that free will exists. Moreover, you cannot believe in rational argumentation without believing that you have free will. That's essentially the claim that I'm going to be putting forth to you now. And so I'll note before I get into my argument that there might be something that seems a little strange about that claim, that if you believe in rational argumentation, then you necessarily believe in free will, because it might seem like you don't have any free will to do otherwise in that specific instance. That's not exactly what I mean. What I mean is something more like this. Consider this analogy. If you believe in arithmetic, the laws of arithmetic, such as, the law of addition, law of subtraction, and all that very fundamental mathematical stuff, if you believe in the laws of arithmetic, then you necessarily have to believe 2 plus 2 equals 4. Why is that the case? Because if you set up the law of addition and all the other stuff that you need, the existence of certain kinds of numbers and all that, then you can derive that 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can derive it through a rational process. So that's sort of what I mean here. It's more like if you believe in arithmetic, then it would be a contradiction if you believe that 2 plus 2 is not 4. And so in a similar sense, what I'm saying here in claim number 2 is if you believe in rational argumentation, then it would be a contradiction if you did not believe in free will. That's the claim that I'm going to try and argue to you here. And so that's a pretty fundamental claim, because it's saying, okay, if you believe in rational argumentation, then you believe that, well, contradictions are false. right? And so if you believe in rational argumentation, then you cannot simultaneously believe in something that is false. It would just be a contradiction. So that's what I'm going to try and argue to you here. If you believe in rational argumentation, then you have to believe in free will. That's the only way to have a consistent belief. Now we can proceed into the argument. So, suppose someone told you that they believed that they had free will. And you asked them, okay, well, why? What's your argument? Why do you believe that? And they said, no, I don't have an argument. I was coerced into believing it by forces that are beyond my control. Would you be convinced by that? Well, no, they just admitted that they don't have an argument. If you don't have an argument, then, well, there's no reason that you should believe their argument because they don't have one. Simple as that. Okay. So keep that in mind. Now let's consider the implications of believing that free will does not exist. If you believe that free will does not exist, then you necessarily believe that everything that you have ever done is completely out of your control. Namely, well, you don't believe that you have free will, so you don't believe that you have the ability to make free choices. You believe that everything that has ever happened to you is the result of physical processes. The way that you can think about this is that, well, you are just a collection of particles, and particles just obey physical laws. So everything that happens, every choice that you make, is really just some set of particles in your brain arranging themselves in some way due to the physical laws. It's not due to you. It's not due to you. It's not due to anything that you did. The particles arrange themselves in a certain way, and that is where everything comes from. Every single effect, every single thing that you do, every single thing that you've ever said, just the result of particles in your brain obeying physical laws. All your thoughts, all of them, just the result of particles obeying physical laws. Completely out of your control. And furthermore, it's not just that you don't have any control to think those thoughts, but the thoughts themselves are just the result of particles obeying physical laws. The thoughts are particles obeying physical laws. Everything that you believe, particles obeying physical laws. Everything that you even think you believe, completely out of your control. There's nothing that you can do to arrive at one belief or another through a rational process. You don't have any free ability to reject falsehoods, to accept truths. You don't have any ability to do so. Furthermore, if there's no free will and everything is just made of particles, there is no such thing as rational argumentation. There's no such thing. It's not possible. It's not possible to rationally argue if you were forced to believe everything that you believe. And you might be thinking, no, I don't believe you. I'm not buying this. Well, you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice to believe anything. If you believe that free will does not exist, you believe that you have no choice but to arrive at the conclusions that you think you believe in, when in reality you don't even believe in them. It's just an intuition that somehow you have that's manifested from particles that are obeying physical laws. You did not arrive at your belief, which you believe that you have, but you really don't, through any rational process. And furthermore, there is no you. If you don't believe in free will, if you don't believe that there's anything that transcends the purely material, then you don't believe that there is a you. You only believe that you are just a collection of particles. You're just a collection of particles if you don't believe in free will. There is no you. It doesn't even make sense to say you don't believe in free will. Rational argumentation as a concept completely collapses. There is no such thing as argumentation. Every thought that you have in your mind right now that you disagree with what I'm saying, just the result of particles obeying physical laws. And of course, the fact that you're annoyed by how many times I've said particles obeying physical laws, that too was completely out of your control, and there's nothing you can do about it. You don't believe it's even possible to have an argument. Any argument you think that you have to the contrary right now is not an argument. You were coerced to even think that you have such an argument, when in reality you don't. Just particles obeying physical laws. So, that's interesting, because when I brought up my hypothetical at the beginning of this argument, You said that, well, you would not believe someone if they just told you they were coerced into believing free will exists by forces beyond their control. So then, why would you believe that that's the case for free will not existing? Why would you use coercion as a means to believe that free will does not exist? You weren't willing to say that, okay, fine, I'll believe in free will if someone was coerced into believing it. But you are willing to say that you believe free will does not exist because, well, the necessary implication is that you were coerced into believing it. That's the only implication of free will denial, is that you were coerced into believing everything that you believe. And furthermore, that there really is no such thing as belief, so even that's contradictory. There's no way that you can hold free will denial without being in an immediate contradiction. For this reason, free will denial is an empty and logically self-defeating philosophy. And you might say, no, I don't believe you. No, I have an argument for free will denial. No, you don't. You don't, because you're admitting that you don't even believe in the ability to freely make arguments. You don't believe in the ability to reject bad arguments and accept good arguments such that you can approach the truth. You don't believe in that. And if you don't believe in that, well, then it's not even possible to really believe in anything. And belief is a rational phenomenon. Rational phenomenon require rational argumentation, and rational argumentation requires that you have free will. Now, you might still have some difficulties with this concept of free will, and I understand it is a difficult concept. There are some reasonable difficulties you might have at first, and so one of the things you might say is, okay, well, you've made this argument that, well, you need to believe that free will exists if you believe in rational argumentation, and you might say, okay, whatever, fine. But then you might say, what if it's possible that we could just disprove the existence of free will? And then, well, just follows that nobody can believe in rational argumentation. It's not even possible. And the answer is that no, you cannot disprove the existence of free will. Because if you disprove the existence of free will, then you've disproved the concept of rational argumentation. But disproof is a concept that belongs to rational argumentation. There is no proof or disproof without rational argumentation. So if you disprove free will, you disprove rational argumentation, and then you disprove the validity of your disproof, in which case you have not disproven anything. So even if you try to rationally rule out free will as a concept, you realize that it's not possible, because then you would rule out the argument that you're even making. It's just not possible. So, furthermore, what I'll say is that if you recognize that all of that was just walking yourself into a contradiction, then I would be willing to bet that you do believe in the existence of rational argumentation. Then it follows that, yeah, you need to believe in free will because of the arguments that we put forth. You might then question, okay, can we experimentally rule out free will? And so again, I would say that the answer that I just provided for trying to logically disprove it, I think that would suffice to address this question too, to say no, you can't experimentally disprove it. But I will also give a few more answers to this question that might actually be a little bit more substantive in regards to experimentation. So the first thing is that there have been people who have run experiments in the attempts to figure out whether or not free will exists. And usually it goes something like, okay, you have some subject, maybe it's me. The experimenter will say, okay, choose, I don't know, right or left hand. Okay, so then I make a choice, and then what they'll do is they'll have these electrodes that'll read my brain signals, and what they'll try to figure out is, was there a subconscious or unconscious brain signal that preceded the conscious signal of me where I thought that I make the choice? And then based on those results, they try to make some conclusion. And some people interpret that as saying that it rules out the existence of free will. Some people say otherwise. And basically, there's definitely no consensus that can be drawn from those experiments. Even within those interpretations, that it's possible to use those experiments to rule out the existence of free will, even within that interpretation, by no means is it clear that free will does not exist. But that's not even the most sufficient answer to this question. The most efficient answer is that, why do you believe that such an experiment would have any bearing whatsoever on the existence of free will in general? What do I mean by that? What do I mean? So, let's say that you did run that experiment, and yeah, you're trying to figure out whether free will exists. You have to make an assumption as an experimenter. You have to assume that if free will exists, then it necessarily operates when you're running that experiment. You need to assume that your subject actually has free will in that moment that you're asking him to make the choice, left or right, A or B, whatever. You have to assume that that's the case. There's no reason that that's generally true. There's no reason that free will necessarily operates whenever you're trying to run an experiment on it. You would have to make that assumption. So you can make that assumption, sure, but if you want to claim that you generally rule out the existence of a concept like free will, you would then have to prove the validity of your assumption. And again, that is not possible for the reasons we've already established. Furthermore, you might say something along these lines. You could say, okay, well, maybe free will did operate within this one experiment, and maybe we found some result one way or the other. Okay, what are you going to do then? What's your conclusion going to be? The only thing that you can generally conclude from that one experiment is that in that experiment, free will either did or did not exist. Anything beyond that is an extrapolation. You cannot use the result of that one experiment to generally say free will does not exist. It's not going to work. You again have to assume that the results of your one experiment apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times. That is a very strong assumption. That is a very strong extrapolation that you're making. There's no way, again, that you're going to be able to generally prove that. You always have to make assumptions when you're running an experiment. You always have to. You're not going to be able to make any assumptions that you'll be able to generally prove. And therefore, there's no experiment that you can use to generally rule out the existence of free will. Okay, so that's one thing. Another question you might have is, well, is it even possible that someone could make a freely willed choice, something beyond physics, and yet that not contradict the internal laws, the physical laws of our universe? That's a fair question. To address it, I'm going to cut to a video that I already filmed previously. Now, what's interesting is that this question actually doesn't really have anything to do with free will. The question, the underlying portion of this question that's important, is whether there's any external cause that could affect the universe without breaking the internal laws. And so I'd like to explain how this could work. So imagine you were running a very detailed computer simulation. So perhaps an n-body simulation, where you say, okay, let's say we have this box. We're going to initialize a distribution of particles. So here's our particles. I don't know, something like this. Okay, and so this is at time equals 0, t equals 0. Now what you can do is you can write in a few lines of code that will determine exactly how these particles interact with one another. And so it could be something like, all right, if these particles are separated by some distance, then they exert some force on one another, very similar to just a Newtonian gravitational force. Okay, so then you have a set of laws that determines how all these particles are going to interact, and therefore that's going to determine how the particles are going to move in response to the positions of every other particle. Okay, so now let's say that you hit go on your simulation. Maybe after some time the simulation evolves, and then, I don't know, you get, let's see, how many do we have here? 7. So maybe the next distribution looks something like this. Okay, so this means that you allowed the simulation to evolve for a while until some t prime. Okay. So now all the particles have different positions because they were responding to one another. Alright, so now the simulation's paused though. You are the simulator. Imagine you wrote in a line of code that simply said, I want to move this particle to that position, this one here, that one there. So now there is no more particle there, or there. Okay. Then you hit go again. And then the system evolves according to the new positions of the particles that you decided on. And, you get some result. Okay, now consider this, though. If you were within that simulation, if you were in that universe, you would have seen that there was a moment at time t prime when the particles just suddenly moved in a way that was completely incompatible with the physical laws that you had programmed in to begin with. There was just that sudden time when they moved. But then the simulation proceeded. It just kept going according to the new positions right after that movement had occurred. So that means that you could run this simulation here, and you could have an external event, which was you choosing to move those particles around. You could run the simulation, there's going to be that external event, and then it proceeds without breaking the laws of physics, the internal laws that you had programmed. So this is actually not a problem for the consideration of free will. I think that this example shows that, yes, in fact, it is possible that an external event could influence the system without breaking any of the internal laws. Another question you might then ask would be, okay, how does free will even mechanically work? How does it even work? And this is not a valid question because, well, as we've discussed, free will is not something that can be mechanically described. Free will is not something that is dictated by physical laws. If there were some mechanical process for how free will works, it wouldn't be free. It just wouldn't be free will. Okay, but then you might say, all right, well, if free will can't be physically described, if it can't be mechanically described, how can it even exist? Okay, so, well, indeed, the premise of that question is true, that free will cannot be physically described. But then we should ask ourselves, okay, well, what is physics? What does it even mean for something to be physically described? Okay, well, physics is the interface between truth and matter. Physics is what truly describes how matter behaves, at least how it tends to behave, because we are asserting that, yes, free will, through some interface with matter, has the ability to affect matter. But physics describes how it tends to behave. Okay, so physics is sort of this interface between truth and matter, and that leads us to the fundamental question. What is truth? Can you physically describe truth? Because you're saying that you're questioning the existence of free will because it can't be physically described. I'm going to ask you then to physically describe what is the truth. Can you provide for me a physical explanation of 2 + 2 = 4? The answer, of course, is that you can't. Truth is just fundamental. Truth simply is.
Math is math.
Okay,
Math
Dad.
is math.
There is no physical description for it. Truth exists independently of whether any physics or matter exists. There's no physical description for truth. And so if it bothers you that there's no physical description for free will, then it should also bother you that there's no physical description for the existence of truth. There's no physical description for truth. And you can even take this a little bit further, because I'm saying that physics is the description of how matter tends to behave, but matter in itself is another irreducible concept. You cannot describe what matter is without referencing other matter, without referencing some other kind of material. So that's another issue there. You can't even physically describe what matter is. You can't physically describe what physics is. There are irreducible concepts that cannot be reduced any further. One of them is truth, one of them is matter. I'm suggesting that free will as well is another irreducible concept. And so furthermore, if you are bothered by the inability to physically describe free will, the inability to reduce any further than free will, then you should be bothered by that same question applying to truth and to matter. You simply cannot reduce any further. You cannot reduce any further than truth, or matter, or free will. The inability to physically describe these things, these very fundamental, irreducible concepts, has no bearing on their existence. And that is an important point. We've already established that we believe in truth. And I presume that you believe in the existence of matter, the stuff that you're made of. That means that we've already established that we believe in things that have no more fundamental physical description. And so for that reason, that cannot be a reason that you refuse to believe in the existence of free will, which would in itself be another one of those irreducible concepts that cannot be described by something more fundamental. Okay, so then you might say, okay, hold up. You're telling me that there's this concept called free will. It can't be disproven. It can't be experimentally falsified. And it can't even be physically described. So why should I believe it? Why should I believe that it exists? We go back to the argument that we made earlier in this video, which is that if you believe in the validity of rational argumentation, then it would be a contradiction if you did not believe in free will. Moreover, you need to believe in free will if you believe in the existence of rational argumentation. Furthermore, what I'll add is that you do have an intuitive sense that at least sometimes you are able to make choices. You have that intuitive sense. Now, I'm not saying that that intuitive sense means that you have free will, but you do have that intuitive sense. You have that intuitive, subjective experience that you can make choices. And my claim is that, roughly speaking, that's what free will would correspond to. So you need to believe in it if you want to believe in rational argumentation, and you do have some conception of what it would be like. So it's not like I'm just pulling this out of nowhere, right? This is something that it would make perfect sense if you believed in it, because you do have the intuition that something like it exists, and you also need to believe in it in order to be consistent in your own set of beliefs. Okay, so then you might say, all right, you know what, whatever, fine. I'll believe in free will. Who cares? Who cares whether free will exists or not? And for the sake of this video, that's perfectly fine. If you're willing to believe in free will, perfectly fine. That's all that I wanted to get across in this video. But like we established, there is an interface between truth and matter. That's what physics is. Physics is the truth that describes how matter tends to behave. The interesting question that would follow would be, okay, what is the interface between truth and free will? And that's what I'm going to be getting into in the next video, so stick around.